So why are a whole load of competitive Space Marine lists running a whole load of Aggressors plus an Apothecary Biologis? Perhaps it's got something to do with the fact that when you buff their shooting by quite a bit, they can down a Land Raider in a single round of firepower with their bolt guns. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd talk through a Space Marine damage combo that seems to have been popping up in really quite a lot of competitive lists. Quite a lot of armies were fielding Aggressors backed up by the Apothecary Biologis, and certainly with some stacked buffs, their shooting damage output can be very silly, never mind the fact that they're fairly tough as well, and of course pretty potent in combat with those power fists. The combo itself is one for the Gladius Task Force, and it uses a combination of the Bolter Discipline Warlord trait with some stratagems and other buffs, but really isn't all that complicated to field, doesn't really require that many units, and you can decide whether or not you want to spend the extra stratagems on trying to make it go to its maximum potential, or just allow them to do what they'd do normally as their unit with their normal damage output and spend the CP elsewhere in the list if it makes more sense. I think perhaps the biggest reason that it might be seeing more competitive play is due to the nerf of the Desolation Squad, weirdly enough. For a lot of Space Marine competitive lists, it was fairly fashionable to field something like an Apothecary in a Desolation Squad with Bolter Discipline, let them have the maximal damage combo from that. But now the Desolation Squad has been reduced in numbers and increased in cost, that's just not really all that efficient anymore. And that means that while Bolter Discipline's a great enhancement, it's probably better off somewhere else. Could be one of the more traditional shooting units, but it does seem that Aggressors are good enough to have it break through. In any case, let's talk through the combo bit by bit and put it all together with their average damage output that you can expect out of them. First up, starting with the Aggressor squad itself, they went down in points a fair bit in the previous balance update. It's now 200 points for 6 of them. Overall, on their own, I think they're a fairly well balanced unit in Codex Space Marines. Reasonably tanky with toughness 6 and 3 wounds, though anti-tank weapons do make fairly short work of them. And the loadout that's relevant for this combo is the bolt guns and fragstorm grenade launchers. I feel like the flamestorm gauntlets aren't too bad and definitely pretty threatening for Overwatch, but you can't get lethal hits from the Apothecary Biologis with them, so they're not going to be that exciting this time round. The Boltstorm gauntlets get you 3 shots out to 18 inches, strength 4 AP 0 and damage 1 and twin linked, and the fragstorm grenade launchers are a blast weapon with d6 shots at strength 4 AP 0 and damage 1 again. Fairly unassuming weapons on their own, pretty good against killing hordes, but they're hardly going to be threatening against enemy tanks all that much. They do handily get an extra AP if you're firing at the closest unit though, with an extra AP -1 if you can land shots against the closest target. That's definitely helpful and it makes them a fair bit more general purpose. Finally, when they're in combat they strike with some twin linked power fists. These guys only hit on a 4+ with them, at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, but they do get twin links. Compared with a lot of Space Marine power fists, that makes them a bit better at punching up against tanks and things. A big squad of these should be something that most units in the game are probably going to struggle to ignore. They are going to be suffering a bunch of wounds with medium AP and damage, so quite nice all-round threats. Leading them into battle, as mentioned, we've got the Apothecary Biologis. He's really quite a cheap support character and essentially fills the role of a lieutenant for the Aggressors at the moment. Games Workshop still haven't released a Gravis Primaris lieutenant despite all the other variations that they've done for them. He's 55 points and his main buff is to give the unit lethal hits both at range and in melee. He gets a single punchy bolt shot at strength 5 AP 1 and damage 2, which actually isn't nothing given that the buffs they're about to get, and he's fairly helpful for objective control as well, getting objective control 3 at base and then going up to 9 if they slay something in melee, though I treat that more of a nice to have. Then what you can do is give the Apothecary Biologist the Bolter Discipline enhancement. This one is rated easily the best out of the Gladius Detachment enhancements, 25 points for sustained hits 1 for a unit, always handy on just about any shooting unit, though Aggressors wouldn't be most people's first pick compared with things like Hellblasters or Sternguard or something. The extra good part for this one though is that in Devastator Doctrine it also gives you a 5+ for critical hits for the unit, and that has a bit of a double effect with the Apothecary Biologis, as it means that every time you roll a 5+ you'll get sustained hits 1, but you'll also get lethal hits as well, as the critical hits trigger that ability as well. The sustained and the lethal hits don't stack, but you will get both, so it means that for every 5 and 6 that you roll you'll get 1 hit on the target and 1 auto wound on the target as well. Overall, just adding up to a whole load of damage and wounds to save between those two rules. Not too bad when you've got 39 shots coming at the enemy, and often at AP -1. Then for a simple damage increase from the Gladius detachment, there's the Storm of Fire detachment. This one's 1 command point to ignore cover normally. Definitely not unhelpful in Warhammer 40k at the moment, with cover saves being really quite easy for most units to get, but perhaps the really good bit is again in Devastator Doctrine, where if you have that going on, Any ranged weapons making those attacks get an extra AP -1 as well, so that in theory means that your Boltstorm gauntlets can be all the way up to AP -2 and ignoring cover. Really quite brutal, and now you're getting to the sort of AP that really threatens heavily armoured units as well as light stuff. Most units in the game are going to be saving on a 4+ at best against them, and you are likely to be stacking a whole bunch of wounds. This one's also a battle tactic as well, so if you included a Gravis captain in the unit as well, you could use this for free as one of his special rules. Then, as mentioned, to get some of the good bits out of both the Storm of Fire stratagem and the Bolt of Discipline Warlord trait, you need to have Devastator Doctrine. At base, that's just kind of helpful for advance and shoot in the first place, could be used if they're foot slogging to try and get them into range. The aggressors don't move enormously fast and they only have 18-inch range on their guns, so that could be the difference between getting them to strike the right target or not. Turning those critical hits onto a 5+ and getting the extra AP though make it doubly helpful, and in general it's going to make sense to try and coordinate the big strike of the units with the time that you use the Devastator Doctrine for free. Though alternatively, if you want another round of maximal striking firepower, you could use the Adaptive Strategy stratagem. That's the one that allows you to flex the Combat Doctrine for a unit, so you could get a further turn of Devastator Doctrine if it made sense. Putting that all together, you've got a unit of 7 models, and this is their damage output with Bolt of Discipline, Devastator Doctrine, Storm of Fire, and the Apothecary Biologis. The unit will get around about 40 shots on average against a single model, plus a bunch more against blast targets, as per the Fragstorm grenade launchers. Almost all the attacks at Strength 4, AP -2, and Damage 1, besides the Apothecary's big pistol. And then all of those shots get a rather standout stack of buffs, lethal and sustained hits on a 5+, so a massive chunk of those are going to be auto-wounding, and then still generating the same amount of regular hits as they normally would. They all ignore cover, and almost half the shots are twin-linked from the Boltstorm gauntlets, and big wound rerolls are excellent for punching up against harder targets. Overall, running the numbers on that, if you were targeting the closest unit, it seems that regardless of what it is, there's a good chance of either killing it or dealing some fairly obscene damage. Anything that's toughness 4 or below has a very good chance of just being slain outright. You kill around about 33 Termagants, so far bigger than a max unit there, around about 10 Space Marine Intercessors, which is kind of impressive I think, 3 or 4 dead Terminators for a toughness 5 target, around 14 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle, could be a Rhino or could potentially be something tougher like a Gladiator tank or something like a Tyranid Haruspex, and then starting to run into a little bit more trouble when you get into hard targets like Land Raiders. Without Oath of Moment, you do around about 9 wounds to a Space Marine Land Raider, still killing over at half of its wounds, which isn't bad for primarily infantry killing weapons, but maybe not quite as devastating as against the infantry targets. Of course then, depending on how they got there, you might be able to follow up with a charge as well. Depends if there's anything left in range or whether they advanced. Perhaps the really exciting times get going though when you do use Oath of Moment, as this one allows you to re-roll all hits to try and fish for those 5s and 6s, and that's well worth doing when they both auto-wound and get you the additional hit as well. Particularly with the lethal hits, it seems that if you add in Oath of Moment to the mix, you add around about 50% damage to the lighter targets, but then getting on for around about double damage against heavier targets. On average, the unit with its bolter shooting alone kills around about 6 or 7 Terminators, around 23 wounds to most standard vehicles, often going to be overkill, and it seems that it just noses into enough damage to slay a Space Marine Land Raider with average rolling in a single round of shooting. Perhaps surprisingly brutal with just bolter damage, never mind any combat threat with Power Fists. Admittedly, this combo does include the full wound rerolls from Oath of Moment, which we do know is going. Losing it will make an impact to the numbers, but perhaps not as much as virtually anywhere else in Codex Space Marines. A huge amount of the damage just comes from the auto wounds already, and then even with all the regular attacks, around about half of them get to re-roll the wound roll already due to the twin linked, so Oath is only really helping out the Fragstorm grenades and the Apothecary's pistol. Losing the wound reroll will reduce the numbers a little bit here, but perhaps not all that significantly. The main thing is the hit reroll, which still works fine with this, presuming the Apothecary Biologis and the Aggressors rules don't change horribly going into the new codex. Then of course, after all the bolter damage, I certainly wouldn't forget that the Aggressors are a combat unit as well. It does depend on how they got to the front, if they are the youth reserves at a Land Raider, and whether or not they had to advance if they're just foot slogging with Devastator Doctrine. But if you can get a charge off, then all those Power Fist attacks with lethal hits and twin links leave a mark on most units. In combat, the unit kills around about another 10 Gaunts. It's particularly nasty against Space Marines, killing around about 6 of them with the Power Fists, and then around about 2 or 3 more Terminators, 8 wounds to most 3+ save vehicles, and still a big 6 wounds to a hard target like a Land Raider. If the stars align and you do manage to get a full round of shooting damage followed by a maximal charge, then things are going to be absolutely brutal. If you happen to be targeting the same unit that's got the Oath of Moment against it as well, then these numbers go up absolutely significantly again, as the aggressors only hit on a 4+, so re-rolling all those failed hits is going to be massive, usually going to be an extra 50% damage there. Overall, kind of hilariously brutal stuff overall, and there's definitely a lot more options for supporting things for the combo, either for extra characters, extra units, and ways to get them to the front. For other characters that can join the unit in addition to the Apothecary, you've got the choice of the Gravis Captain Marnius Calgar and Tor Garadon. Ironfather Phyros lacks the Captain keyword, so can't I believe in addition. The Gravis Captain seems like a pretty reasonable extra include if you want one for an extra 80 points. He can allow the units to use Storm of Fire for free and potentially Armour of Contempt in the enemy turn to make them a bit tougher. Plus adds a few more shots to the unit with his Boltstorm Gauntlet, which is never really going to be a bad thing when you're buffing the shooting this much, plus really quite a lot more melee power. And if the unit does get whittled down, he's really quite tough as characters go as well, which is no bad thing. I feel like for 80 points he's very usable. Otherwise, going a bit more spendy, Marnius Calgar for the Ultramarines generates CP, is generally just strong in terms of damage and defense in himself, particularly with his 2 little guards, and he can allow the units to both advance and shoot and advance and charge. Means that if the aggressors are foot slogging up the board under Devastator Doctrine, they don't have to choose between the two and can still make use of that advance and still go on to have the chance of charging. Finally, Tor Garadon for the Imperial Fist I think again is very efficient. He's 90 points, and I feel like maybe there is a little bit of annoying overlap with the Apothecary. He doubles up on lethal hits and ignores cover, but he does bring some scary melee to the table against monsters and vehicles, and a grav gun with these kind of shooting buffs definitely isn't the worst thing to have in the unit either. His melee really is pretty cool though, with the strength 12, plus the bonus that he personally gets against hard targets. Otherwise, always worth mentioning the Space Marine shooting buffs. Storm Speeder Hellstrike for an extra AP could be a really big deal against some of the tougher targets that they might be shooting at. Things with a 2+ save might be taking AP -3 shots there, or it might just be helpful if you need to shoot at something that isn't the closest target. The Thunderstrike could help out against enemy vehicles, and Incursors could give you a +1 to hit, though I'd say that's maybe a little bit more limited value given that most of the value of it comes from those 5s and 6s. Finally, there's the question of how they get into battle, and I genuinely feel that these guys have really quite a lot of pretty credible options really. Foot slogging is minimal investment, which definitely isn't too bad. They've still got a pretty reasonable threat range with Devastator Doctrine. On average it's going to be somewhere around 26 inches or so after an advance, but that still might not be enough to get them in range of their optimal target, or at least not for the entire squad. You could think about Strategic Reserve potentially, if your opponent doesn't have enough things to screen the important stuff out. It'd be very sad to have your big damage combo turn up on the edge of an enemy army and only be able to fire at some chaff infantry. I've seen a fair few people making good use of Land Raiders for them. They do seem to be quite popular with the aggressors in competitive Space Marine lists these days. The Land Raider can move 12 inches, drop the squad out 3 inches out the front, plus an 18-inch gun range gives you a 33-inch overall threat range, which is much better. It's going to have to be either a Redeemer or Crusader though, due to the amount of transport capacity that it has. And if you want an extra supporting character as well, it would have to be the Land Raider Crusader. I guess another advantage of the Land Raider is that it gives you a slightly higher likelihood of allowing a follow-up charge. Effectively a 15-inch movement and then still being able to make a charge after that is rather nice. Finally, for chapter-specific stuff, Uriel Ventris could be used to give the squad a deep strike. That's very free and very powerful for Ultramarines to get the squad exactly where they need to be and then open fire. And you could even use Rapid Ingress as well in the right circumstances. That could be pretty devastating for drop, then shoot, then charge. You just have to make sure that there's somewhere that they could land that's safe from the majority of enemy damage. Finally, for the Blood Angels, if they're using Gladius and not the Sons of Sanguinius detachment, they could use the Blood Angels Librarian Dreadnoughts to deliver the combo. That one's got its Wings of Sanguinius rule, where it gets to teleport infantry units around the map. Potentially that could deliver the aggressors with a turn 1 massive alpha strike, and it is quite funny to think of the aggressors descending from the skies on Wings of Fire. Overall, I can definitely see why this is looking like it's a popular unit at the moment. 280 points for a pretty obscene amount of damage on a unit that's at least reasonably tanky, and lots of fairly good options for how they can get into the fight. I guess it remains to be seen whether or not this will survive intact into the Space Marine Codex. It's very much a Gladius only combo, so wouldn't be useful for the other detachments given Bolter Discipline and the supporting stratagems. But I feel like at least the Gladius supporting rules are very unlikely to change. I guess it's just whether or not they mess around with any of the rules or points values and things on the Apothecary Biologis or the Aggressors. In any case, let me know what you think and how you'd be tempted to play the combo down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.